time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live here in the studios Stan Sorcher and Selden Prentice. Stan Sorcher is president of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, and Selden Prentice is a facilitator of the Trade Policy Group at 350 Seattle, and they had been on the show back in April and are back to talk further about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the TPP. So start out, and for people who aren't familiar, let's start with what is the TPP? What is Trans-Pacific Partnership?
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a big trade agreement with 12 countries around the Pacific. It's been under negotiation for several years. It is based on the NAFTA template, so if people are familiar with NAFTA, you can just expand that to many more countries and more of the global economy. The U.S. Trade Representative is our chief negotiator. He characterized the Trans-Pacific Partnership as very similar to the U.S.-Korea deal in terms of the details in the language, and that was concluded. The U.S.-Korea trade agreement was concluded a few years ago, so the experience with that, the experience with NAFTA, really the experience with all the other trade agreements should carry forward into TPP. The negotiations concluded in October, and the text was released earlier this month, so people can look at the language. There are 30 chapters covering different aspects of global trade.
5,600 pages, as I understand it, or thereabouts.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail because the trade agreement covers tariffs, and there are thousands and thousands of tariffs. So a lot of the pages are in the tariff schedules, which are extremely important to somebody who's growing lima beans, but not very important in terms of the rules for globalization, the principles, and the legal standards. So the 30 chapters are written in, of TPP are written in language that you can read, but you have to bear in mind that they were written by diplomats, and this was the result of years of very difficult negotiations, and this is what diplomats do. They write language. The purpose of diplomacy is to get a deal and to give both sides the impression that they got what they want. So when you, as a citizen, read the language, it means something to you in plain English terms, but it probably means something else to a trade lawyer, and something else to a diplomat, and something else to industry group. The industry groups had a lot of influence over this, and they were looking for specific conditions that are very important to them, and they, for the most part, got them. So when you read the language, or when an elected official reads the language, you don't necessarily understand the context or the history or the way this will be interpreted going forward. And again, remember, the diplomats are trying to make you think you got what you wanted. So
and we bring this up because I was just talking to a congressman yesterday who said, don't worry, I'm going to read the language of this thing. I'm not going to just listen to the White House, because the White House makes a lot of claims about what's in there, and we'll talk in a minute about those claims not being accurate. But nonetheless, if you don't really know, as Stan said, the history of these court cases, tribunal cases, where countries can, and corporations in particular, can challenge environmental laws and safety laws, health laws in these trade tribunals. If you don't know about how those cases work, you might think the language in the trade agreement is going to protect us. So, for example, the White House claims, don't worry, public health and public interest laws cannot be challenged in these trade tribunals. We have language in there that says that. And so if you're a congressperson or a senator and you read that in the text, because it is in there, you might think, no problem. But if you have studied this and looked at it more closely, looked at prior cases, talked to trade lawyers who know this stuff, you will realize that language in the text that supposedly protects laws in the public interest, you'll realize that language is going to be ineffective.
Right. So, for instance, if you were buying a car or a house, somebody might say to you, you should have a lawyer look at that contract. Or if you're defending yourself in court, your neighbor says your property line is here and you think it's over there. Good advice would be maybe you should have a lawyer help you out with this. These trade agreements are going to determine how life is organized in 2050, right, for a generation or so in terms of globalization. So Selden makes a good point. There's a promise or an assurance made by our negotiators that you can do anything you want to regulate in the public good. And one of our members of Congress held town hall meetings, and he was showing us this language, 9.15, and it says you can do anything you want to regulate in the public good. And it's, again, written in language that's a little hard to follow as it's being read to you, but if you go back and look, it says right in the middle of that sentence, it says, as long as the regulation complies with all the other terms in the trade agreement, you can do whatever you want. Well, all the other terms of the trade agreement give substantial rights to global investors and deny your ability to regulate the public good. So as long as you have a regulation that puts the investors' interests first and public interest second,
Then you're okay.
then you're okay. Yeah, sure, that'll be fine.
But that's not what most of the laws that we want our country to be able to pass necessarily will do. We want our country to pass laws to protect us from climate change and to minimize the damage of climate change. And some of those laws might not put investors first, corporations first, and they should still be allowed to stand scrutiny under these trade tribunals. But most likely they won't, because that's been the history. There's been case after case where laws in the public interest to protect the environment, for example, in Canada, they had a moratorium on fracking. Environmental cleanup legislation in different countries has been challenged over and over again, and frequently the investors win those cases and receive damages from those countries paid by the taxpayers. And this is what we want to stop, and we don't see that happening with the TPP. We believe it's going to continue.
So our legal tradition and our courts, and this is something that took us 200 years to sort out, our legal tradition is it's completely appropriate and legitimate for government to regulate in the public good, and if it's rational and serves a public purpose and is not a complete taking, as they say under the Fifth Amendment, you can go ahead and do it and not owe compensation to a business. So if we have cigarette packaging laws that have a disclaimer on the front that this could affect your health, that's a regulation in the public good, and our courts say, sure, that's fine. Canada's courts say that's fine. Australia's courts say that's fine. New Zealand's courts say that's fine. TPP says, no, wait, you have now diminished the commercial interests of that investor and you have to compensate them. So they have a different standard in the trade agreements, different from our legal tradition, different from our Constitution. And when the investor challenges a regulation in the trade agreements, they go to a tribunal. The tribunal applies the language in the trade agreements and pays no attention to our Constitution, our legal tradition, the Australian High Court or their tradition. And so it's very important to see how these rules are used. And again, going back to the town hall with a member of Congress, he was so sure that this was the language that he was looking for that he was boasting about it in the town hall. The Australian trade minister was challenged on exactly that language, and he said, sure, this is fine. A trade lawyer who represents countries in the TPP, when they are challenged by the disputes, he said, look at those 5 words in the middle of this sentence. It says, and I forget what they are, but the 5 words, but they say as long as you are complying with everything else in the document, you can have these regulations. And there were other conditions elsewhere in that chapter that again gave greater rights to the investors. So we will have, now that the language is out, we'll have 60 days for the public to examine it. This is the time when public interest groups can look through the language and point to specific provisions in there that speak to labor rights or human rights or public health, food safety, internet freedom, prudent regulation of banks, all these issues and topics and interests that regular people in civil society have will be in somewhere in the 30 chapters, and it's sometimes very difficult, even for elected officials who are going to vote on this, to get the full picture in just 60 days. It would have been much better if we could have had these conversations over the 5 years that the negotiations were going on.
Yeah, it's just really, I one day I was actually talking to Stan and thinking about how complex this trade agreement is. A reminder to your listeners that although it's a trade agreement, it really addresses so much more than trade, as you can hear from our discussion. It addresses the environment, it addresses the internet, it addresses financial Wall Street regulation, et cetera, drug patents. So it covers way more than just trade. And yet the public and the public interest groups and the citizens are supposed to be able to review this and look at it in 60 days. This is no way to pass laws that affect our future so profoundly, It affect our entire democracy. It's just shocking. And, some of these Congress people kind of expect the public to be reviewing this. This is not, most people have jobs. They don't have time to be reviewing arcane trade law. But for those who are listening who this worries, please do look up summaries of this from Public Citizen. They have a great website, or Sierra Club has a great section on trade. There are other sites as well, but at least go and read the summaries. And if you think this is scary, please contact your congressional representatives in both the House and the Senate, particularly the House. That's where this fight is going to end up. But they need to hear from you.
So there was a town hall held by one of our members of Congress, and Rosalinda Guillen, who's active with farm workers, spoke. And she said that she has lived experience with NAFTA, and everybody who had that experience in Mexico understood the consequences it had to them and their families and their communities. And here are all these people who've come to Washington State who are working hard, sometimes having two jobs. She said, "We don't have time to read the text, right? We're not gonna be reading the text." But it's clear to her what the consequences of these NAFTA-style agreements have. They're not just about tariffs on dried lima beans. So one of the talking points that the president uses and the U.S. Trade Representative uses is that these trade agreements are going to set the rules for globalization, and that's actually a very important point. If we're going to set the rules for globalization, and we're going to affect the lives of Rosalinda Guillen and people in her community, and Selden and people in her community, and me and you and people in our communities, we should do that with a political process. And it should be part of what we think of as democracy, and the interests of important stakeholders should be included, and their voices should be represented in the text. So there's, the president sometimes talks about this as a geopolitical thing, but this is really setting the rules for globalization. It's a governance document in kind of similar to the way the Constitution is a governance document. It's not just a trade agreement.
So where the average person who is looking at, let's say, a contract when you sign up for a service like Facebook, and there's like a 2-page contract there that you basically click a box on.
Yeah.
And we all skip that because it's way too complicated to read, and we don't want to waste our time. So that's 2 pages. You compare that to the 5,600 pages that this document is made up of, and so there's elected representatives that think it falls on us, which is true, falls on us to review this and get back to them if they have time to talk to us.
I mean, at least one representative implied that we should all be reading this, and he admitted he should be reading it, and he said, shame on the Congress people who don't bother to read it, which will probably happen. But he sort of implied, it's up to you to read it and get back to me. Yeah. And it's really shocking to me that that's what's become of our democratic process, at least when it comes to trade agreements.
Again, there's some lived experience we have. We don't have to read the language. We can see how it works. I think a lot of people are familiar with dolphin-safe tuna, dolphin-safe labeling on tuna fish. That was challenged by the Mexican fishing industry as a non-economic barrier to trade. It was, as one member of Congress said at one of these town meetings, it's protectionist, right? We're just protecting our own tuna fish industry. And I thought we were protecting dolphins. And I thought it was legitimate and legal and appropriate and part of our political tradition, if we want to protect dolphins, to protect dolphins. Similarly, so we lost that in a trade tribunal over and over again.
We've tried the WTO.
Right. And a similar one is country of origin labeling. So my shirt tells me that it was made in Sri Lanka, and my softball glove says it was made in Korea. And we accept this as part of our consumer knowledge. That was extended, that country of origin labeling was extended to meat and chicken. And under the Mexican and Canadian beef and chicken industries objected, and under NAFTA they went to a tribunal and challenged meat labeling and chicken labeling for country of origin as protectionist. And we lost that. And we tried to fix the labels and we lost it again. And the House actually voted to repeal labeling of beef and chicken under this pressure from the trade tribunals. So we get assurances that nothing in the trade agreements will overrule a U.S. law or overrule our Supreme Court. Well, again, credit to the diplomats for coming up with that language. All I know is that we lost these cases on things that we think are completely appropriate, legitimate, within the scope of how we want to manage our society. And the House of Representatives certainly folded on this. My tuna fish cans still have dolphin-safe labels on them, but we've lost other cases too. Clove cigarettes. We had smoking cessation and trying to protect young people from starting smoking with clove cigarettes. We lost that case. And other countries have lost similar cases. It's clear that the trade tribunals in practice can make other countries back down from regulations that their citizens and constituents of their legislators think are completely appropriate, legitimate, and constitutional, and something that they should be doing. And again, the interest in the trade tribunals is investors first, and public interests come after that.
It's really true. It's really true. And I want to mention a little bit about other aspects of the environment in the TPP because, again, the president had said this is a 21st century trade deal. It's got the highest standards ever. And by the way, those statements have been made about every single trade deal in the last decade or so, probably the last 20 years. But nonetheless, you could, as a supporter of Obama, think, okay, well, maybe this one really is different. But in fact, the environmental standards are actually weaker in some regards in this trade deal. It doesn't have anything to change the dismal enforcement history of prior trade deals with regard to the environment. So the idea would perhaps have been that this will be different, we'll really enforce these standards, but there's nothing in this trade agreement that indicates there will be any different enforcement mechanism than we've had before. And the history is that there's never been an enforcement of any of the environmental standards in prior trade deals. So we're not seeing anything different here. So that's another example where the TPP does not appear to be meeting up to what the president says.
You know, the president had a great speech at Nike, of all places, when he was promoting the labor rights and the human rights. And like Selden says, here are very attractive promises about labor rights and human rights. And Today, I think the president is in Malaysia visiting a refugee camp. Malaysia has the worst record on human rights and dealing with refugees. They have a serious problem with forced labor and child labor in their electronics industry, in the textile industry, and child labor particularly in the palm oil industry. The U.S. State Department evaluates every country in the world every year on human trafficking. The United States is in a Tier 1, it's called. We have problems with human trafficking, but we try and deal with it. 5 of the other TPP countries are in Tier 2, which means that they have human trafficking problems and they're not very effective with dealing with it. And Malaysia is in the worst category, that they have serious human trafficking problems and are doing a terrible job of dealing with it. And so here's President Obama visiting a refugee camp. Earlier this year, there was terrible news stories about refugee camps with essentially slavery conditions, mass graves. This was just awful. And Malaysia at that time was in this Tier 3 category. Later in the year, Reuters had a story the other day that the State Department evaluation kept Malaysia in the Tier 3 category, but senior State Department officials changed the report and upgraded Malaysia to Tier 2. It's no coincidence, I'm sure, that when the Senate passed Fast Track, the enabling legislation for TPP, they put a condition in Fast Track that in order to get this expedited process in Congress, any trade agreement brought to Congress could have no Tier 3 country in it. So there's Malaysia, a Tier 3 country, and suddenly the State Department upgrades them to Tier 2 with no justification, no explanation, certainly no improvement in the conditions in Malaysia. So when Selden is talking about a history of never enforcing environmental protections and doing a terrible job on human rights and labor rights, again, Malaysia has great laws, they don't enforce them. Vietnam is going to pass laws, and I doubt that they're going to be enforced. And there's certainly nothing in the language of TPP and nothing in the will of our government to enforce whatever language is there, even the weak language. That is, I think, a burden that the proponents of TPP cannot get past. We simply can't take an assurance from President Obama or all the presidents before him, back to Gerald Ford, that this is going to be any different from what we've seen in the past.
And if you think about whatever presidents we might have in the future as well,
Right.
how well would Donald Trump enforce the environmental standards or the labor standards of this trade agreement?
Or Marco Rubio.
Or Marco Rubio, or whoever it might be. So it's even if some people think, well, but I trust the president, I trust President Obama, he's not going to be around much longer.
And as we found with the previous agreements like the WTO, NAFTA, it really brings everyone down to the lowest common denominator in terms of rules. And I also want to have you address the language that they're using for this is really important. When you're saying investor, we're really talking about large corporations
Yes.
that both wrote the bulk of this trade
Correct.
deal, as well as the ones that are directly going to benefit from it.
Correct. And that, I'm glad you bring that up, because one of the things about it, yes, so we perhaps didn't explain clearly how these tribunals work. So it is that if your country is part of the trade deal and you, a corporation, are invested in another country in the trade deal, and that country passes a law that you believe is affecting negatively your investment, you are able to sue in one of these trade tribunals and challenge the law. The trade tribunal can't make the country change the law, whereas the WTO can. But under these trade agreements like TPP, the trade tribunal could award damages that the taxpayer of that country would pay, the taxpayers of that country would pay. But what's interesting about it is corporations can just move. So American corporation can move itself overseas and become a multinational corporation, and then use the trade tribunals to challenge our own laws. And we've seen that kind of thing happen as well. And Canadian corporations have done that. So that they could sue their own country under NAFTA. They moved to the U.S. and then sued Canada under NAFTA. So that's the other really cynical aspect of this whole process, is it's supposedly to protect corporations who invest in overseas in a country where maybe their laws are, their court system is kind of weak, and so they need these trade tribunals. That's the theory. But they're being used to challenge perfectly well enacted, democratically enacted laws.
So in the trade tribunals, every complaint is filed by a corporation, or an investor in this case. Every defendant, as we would think of it, is a country. But individual citizens don't have access to this, and anybody protecting the environment doesn't have access to this. So one of the promises, the assurances that the negotiators have given us is that, well, you have access to exactly the same dispute settlement system that corporations do. Yeah, except we don't. That's just not true. And we would rely on the U.S. Trade Representative to act on behalf of labor and act on behalf of the environment. And again, the history is that they have never done that. There's been one modest complaint, which didn't actually get to the dispute settlement with Guatemala, which has terrible labor right protections, and no action on environmental violations of the environmental conditions. So the trade tribunals and the WTO process is entirely one-sided in favor of global corporations.
Just to have about a minute left. So what would you like people to do?
I would like people to call your congressperson in your district, as well as your senators, and let them know what you think of this deal. And let them know that you think it's a travesty of our democracy, really. It's a corporate coup, this deal. And one last point I want to make. This trade deal does not climate change at all. And here's the worst disaster our world has ever faced, and it's not mentioned in the trade deal.
And many of the rules in this actually undermine climate change.
Exactly. The ability to challenge laws in these trade tribunals will and has affected our ability to fight climate change.
Right. Everything we do for climate change will have to compensate the investors for their loss, which is, again, not our legal tradition, but it will be the rule that we set for globalization if TPP passes.
All right. And Public Citizen, I believe, is a good resource for people if they want to learn more about this?
Yes, go to Public Citizen. They have really in-depth analysis of this.
All right. And I believe their website is publiccitizen.org.
Sounds right.
And Global Trade Watch.
Very good. All right. With that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you both very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Thank you so much.